Riddle me this. How do you continue a story that's over? Ever since his debut movie, I've been a fan of John Wick. In fact, the story elements of the series can serve as subject for more than one video, so if you'd like me to continue my deep dive into the franchise, feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to oblige. The backbone of the John Wick narrative, that is, movies 1 through 4, is a continuous build-up towards a grand climactic ending, and each installment in grand storytelling fashion pushes the story forward, knocking the legendary Baba Yaga from one status quo to another. The first one forces the master assassin out of retirement, showing the audience exactly why the man was so terrifying. But most importantly, forcing Wick to shed his ordinary life he worked so hard to attain and step back into the criminal underworld. The second movie pushed Wick to kill Santino D'Antonio, anointed member of the High Table and prominent leader of the Italian Mafia, and it pushed Wick to do so inside a Continental. One of the two sacred rules in the world of Wick that must never be broken is that no business can be conducted on the Continental grounds, under penalty of death. And unfortunately for Wick, this includes revenge. And the first movie saw Wick sacrifice his blissful life to his vengeful thirst. The second movie saw him sacrifice his connection to the underworld, leaving him nowhere to run except one final refuge. The third movie sees Wick on the run, with his goal being to make amends to the High Table and reclaim his life under it. This involved retreating to the only home he had left, the Roma, the organization that adopted him as an orphan, and then of course severing all ties with them in exchange for one last favor. And while he does receive the favor and continues his journey of redemption in the eyes of the High Table, this places Wick in the position of having lost his new life, his old life, and his entire past. However, towards the end, this is where we see John Wick's choices turn from vengeful to somewhat virtuous, since he is granted the choice to earn forgiveness from the High Table, yet chooses to toss away that life again, this time for friendship. Wick was tasked with killing his friend Winston in exchange for his second chance, but ultimately refused to do so. And the fourth movie shows Wick declaring all-out war on the High Table, his goal being to eliminate each and every member. But, as many have pointed out, there will always be another to step into the role of the one who died. Even the Elder, the man who sits above the High Table and above all other members, can be killed and replaced, leaving Wick to face an endless unwinnable battle. Meanwhile, Wick's friend Kane has been blackmailed into hunting him down. Either he eliminates Wick, or the table kills his daughter. Long story short, the fourth Wick movie emphasizes hopelessness, that against the High Table there is no light at the end of the tunnel. Even in the proposed best case scenario, John Wick walks away after killing Kane and dooming his daughter. All while the Marquis de Gramont, the man who represented the face of the High Table and who led the war against Wick and his allies, walked away without punishment. So, when John was able to feign a loss and trick the Marquis into entering the final duel, so the uppity brat could deliver the final death blow to the Baba Yaga after Kane did all the work, only for John to kill the Marquis instead. Not only freeing John Wick from any obligation to the table, but Kane and his daughter as well. The four-part story saw Wick drowning in an endless sea of hopelessness, but ends idealistically, almost romantically. Kane was free, his daughter was free, Wick was free, the villain had been punished, and Winston reclaimed everything he'd lost. And of course, John Wick dies, paying for his sins with his life, but not as the villainous Baba Yaga, but as John Wick, a man and loving husband. The story was complete, and the book closed on John Wick, punctuating an ending so perfect that even as a fan of the franchise, I was satisfied seeing the story end there. In fact, the ending was so perfect, any continuation would greatly diminish the tale. And then John Wick 5 was announced. What madness could this be? There are many obvious possibilities for a movie set after 4's conclusion, and not one seems like a good idea. The first question is, how can there be a John Wick 5 if the character is dead? Well, one major speculation is that it might continue the story left behind by John Wick 4, but without the titular character. Instead, we might follow one of the characters left behind in Wick's mad rampage of revenge. The popular choice is watching Akira Shimazu's revenge against Kane for the death of her father Koji. While that would be an interesting story to follow and the one teased at the very end of John Wick 4, following Akira wouldn't really be a John Wick movie, more like an Akira Shimazu movie. The other popular speculation is that this is going to be a prequel movie, one set before John Wick's death. While this could give us more context and insight into Wick as a character, it would feel cheap, cashing in the John Wick name for some throwaway movie. We already know Wick is a legendary assassin. We already know how his story ends. And of course, the third popular speculation, John Wick actually survived the events of the fourth movie and asked Winston and possibly Kane to help him fake his death. After all, the table may have promised to leave him alone, but what would stop an old enemy from hunting him down anyway? You know, avoiding another Santino situation. But if this is the case, where would it lead? After all, a John Wick 5 would imply a continuation of his story, the story that's already complete. The obvious solution is John Wick comes out of hiding again to, what, fight the High Table? Again? Even if the creators find a clever and intriguing foe for Wick to battle, said battle would very likely be against the High Table, or on behalf of the High Table. In other words, they'd have concluded the story only to continue the same story again. And Wick will either fight another enemy he's already concluded his fight with, or start a new battle against a lesser enemy. After all, there are not a lot of foes out there that can top the High Table. Not only would it feel disjointed, it would diminish the graceful send-off John Wick 4 gave the character. It would kind of be like Star Wars ending perfectly with the destruction of the Empire's greatest weapon, the redemption of Darth Vader, and the death of the Emperor, only for the sequel to give the bad guys an even deadlier super weapon and somehow Palpatine returns. So if none of these options work, what possibly could? Can we even continue the story from where it left off in John Wick 4? Well, again, ideally there would be no John Wick 5. The best ending, narratively speaking, would be for John Wick to stay dead, his life reclaimed, his friends happy, and his sins paid for. But if there must be a fifth movie, my suggestion would be returning to its roots, but with one narrative twist. Remember, the first John Wick movie was self-contained. It had a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end. There was no need for a sequel to tie up loose ends. This mentality will be necessary for the fifth movie, especially if it's going to be the last one. The fifth movie will benefit from the lore and character we've seen from the previous four movies, but must also be self-contained with its own beginning, middle, and definitive end. But I've already said we shouldn't pick up the old story, so where is this going? Well, we'll start a new story, just like the first John Wick movie gave us a new story. But as far as what this story will be about, as always, we can look to the hero's journey. And I know, by now this sounds completely cliche, but hear me out. Believe it or not, John Wick's story actually does travel the hero's journey rather smoothly, starting off in the normal world in John Wick 1, which of course is where he also crosses the threshold into the extraordinary world. Note that Winston is Wick's main mentor, and we also see where Wick trained. We then move into the Road of Trials, and Wick definitely goes through Road of Trials. Wick then faces temptation in the desert, facing the choice of either dying or killing Winston, his closest friend. This would mean selling his soul to the High Table and sacrificing his humanity, all for the precious memory of joy. By John Wick 4, Wick is at his peak, his most focused, and everything leads to his moment of death and rebirth, his face-off against the High Table, his duel against Kane, and ultimately the Marquis, who serves as the very face of the table itself. But if you look closely, we've only reached the halfway mark in the journey. This is where the story typically ends, because this is where the character's role as a hero typically ends. Why? Because after our hero walks through the abyss and experiences death and rebirth, they have achieved their full potential. They finish their journey from inexperienced youth to fully realized hero. And what happens after this is usually assumed. This is where the hero makes their return home and becomes a mentor to the next generation, starting the cycle all over again. This is why, before Disney took over, the popular next move for Luke Skywalker after his original trilogy was to build his own Jedi Temple and train the next generation, like he does in Jedi Academy. So how does John Wick fit into all this? Well, John Wick experienced the metaphorical death of the Baba Yaga when he was released from his old life of an assassin, and then actual death as the man John Wick. However, if he survived the events of John Wick 4, then he has experienced a rebirth. His journey is complete, presumably wiser and better than he was. The next step, typically, would have Wick take on an apprentice. But considering his whole story is fighting to get away from that old life, this seems unlikely. Even worse, if he does become a mentor to another assassin, it would significantly damage the meaning behind Wick's entire journey. So where should we go then? In Wick's case, his return journey might be to the state we find him in Helen in the first movie, only better. Remember, in the first movie, Wick had lived a peaceful life for years where he lived with his beloved wife Helen. However, that life and freedom was paid for in blood, via his impossible task. And this time, Wick defied the High Table and won. Another impossible task. Giving his life to free his friends or leaving them in a better position and then ultimately dying would more or less do the job of redeeming his past wrongdoings, somewhere in the vein of redemption equals death. If we're going to have John Wick both survive and pick up his guns one last time, not only must it be a new story, but also for a different purpose. Simply put, my suggested idea for John Wick 5, if there must be one, would be the story where John Wick works towards final redemption, essentially using the life he has left, honoring Helen, and redeeming himself for the lives he took, the people who paid for his selfishness and all his past sins. For example, it could be interesting to see John Wick learning of the confrontation between Kane and Akira, seeing this will either end with one of them dead or both. Wick then reluctantly steps back into the fray. However, it falls into an uneasy alliance with one of Koji's former rivals, appears to have taken the territory that once belonged to the Shimazu family. Perhaps the three must team up to fend off the rival family. Over the course of it all, Kane dies defending Akira from a bullet, saving her life and telling Wick to live for both of them. Seeing Kane die sparks Wick's infamous rage, and together with Akira, they whittle down the family's power. Maybe Akira gets kidnapped, and the final showdown is Wick confronting the enemy, putting aside his need to avenge Kane and focus on saving Akira. Maybe the villain leaves alive, grateful for his life. Akira could then confront Wick, feeling troubled that her father's killer died to save her, and still feeling that she should have eliminated her father's rival. Here, Wick could explain the value of peace over rage, a peace he has achieved after using his skills to save someone rather than destroy someone. And that infamous rage, that one last piece of the Baba Yaga, nearly cost him everything he held dear. The old life he built with Helen, his home, his car, the ring that remained as one of his last mementos of her. And all it got him was a bunch of dead friends, endless enemies, and little else. Regardless of where the story goes, I think the climax should involve Wick overcoming his major flaw, his rage. And not only overcome his flaw, but overcome it in favor of a greater good. He chooses peace over revenge, chooses to save Akira's life over ending the life of a man who killed his friend. This way, Wick ensures a future for Koji's family, and finally extinguishes his iconic rage. In summary, should there be a John Wick movie after 4? I don't believe so. But if 5 is inevitable, then it can't follow the same tale. The story of John Wick's war against the High Table is done. For a 5th film to continue the story of Wick without damaging the results of the 4th one, it should act as a kind of epilogue, and also start a new story, the final story of John Wick's journey, ideally focusing on his final redemption, accomplishing one grand virtuous act, and stamping out the rage of the Baba Yaga once and for all.